Wait, share your screen with your audience. मतलब Hello, I am Ajit Kumar Jha, CEO of Power Pixar channel. And for the first time, I'm trying to make a live video on the American presidential polls. And we have made one about a couple of weeks ago, but all of you know that 5th November is the American presidential polls. So this video is basically focusing on Kamala's campaign. Kamala Harris, who is the Democratic nominee, who is actually the vice president of the US. That we are going to basically do a SWOT analysis of her campaign. What is going right? What is going wrong? To recap, on August 2nd, August 2, Kamala essentially became the nominee, official nominee of the Democratic Party as the presidential candidate, presidential nominee. So the question is, since then, we saw a major turnaround in the American polls. If you remember, when Joe Biden was the Democratic Party nominee, the entire election seemed as if Trump is going to win. And the reason is not because Biden, who actually had beaten Trump in the past, not because he was not a good candidate, but because of his age. When he came for the first presidential debate, he began stammering, he began forgetting, he began. So there was this memory lapse while he was speaking, and that gave a signal that he was too old for the presidential fight with former President Trump. Now, the reality is that Trump himself is 78 years old. He himself looks very tired, and half the time he's just talking stuff which you don't understand what he's saying. But the reason at that time, Biden, who was barely 3 years older than Trump, was persuaded by the Democratic leaders to step aside, and Kamala Harris was brought in. She was the vice presidential candidate at that time, but now she's the presidential nominee of the Democratic Party. And what did we see? We saw a complete turnaround. In fact, Kamala's popularity started surging from the bottom. And in fact, there was a honeymoon period of almost 2.5 months where Kamala's popularity surged in such a manner that not only remember, Kamala Harris is the underdog in this campaign, right? Most people didn't know her very well at that time. And Trump is a former president. But the popularity surge was so high that not only Kamala beat Trump in overall popularity, in fact, overall popularity in the US, she was beating Trump almost, in some cases, 5 points, 7 points. There was a time when she was really going strong. And especially, what was interesting, that the battleground states, the swing states in America, which we have talked about in the past, and most people know which are those states. They are about between 7 to 10 states, which are the swing states. Arizona, Nevada, closer to the West Coast, next to California. And then rest about, let's say, 7 to 8 in the East, including Florida, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and several others. We'll talk about it as we go on. So even in those, there was a time when she was leading against Trump in almost all of them. However, recently, I would say in the last week, now that about 18 days are left for the polls, last 1 week, we have seen a bit of a dip, or maybe last 10 days, a bit of a dip in Kamala's popularity ratings. Why has that happened? It's happening in some of the battleground states, for example, in Arizona, in Nevada, in some of the other states. Now, there's so much assessment going on by different polling agencies that it's difficult to give you all the data. But let's assume that at least in the battleground states, Kamala's popularity has begun dipping somewhat. In fact, Rasmussen poll, which I trust the most, I mean, there are like almost scores of agencies polling practically every day in the US elections. Rasmussen poll, which I trust the most, has shown about a 2%, which I would consider a significant dip. Now, why has that happened? What is going wrong? And what should Kamala Harris do from now on? One reason for the dip, according to me, is because Kamala Harris has started suddenly changing her campaign. In the last, let's say, 3 weeks or so, she ended up going in two different directions. One direction, she thought, or her pollsters thought, that if Kamala, who is considered a progressive, in fact, people who don't like her call her a socialist, sometimes they call her a communist, which is incorrect. But however, in America, communist, the word communist is considered, basically a very unpopular term. Because remember the Cold War days, they associate communism with China and Russia, and most Americans can't stand that word. So, because she is progressive, left of center, so they kind of reckoned that if she would move rightwards, or let's say move first of all towards the median voter, which is at the center, and maybe a little right, she might be able to appeal to the moderate Republicans, to Republicans who hate Trump. Quite a few of them hate Trump. We saw that during the primaries. The Nikki Haley, those who were voting for Nikki Haley, which was only about, let's say, about 20% of Republicans, they can't stand Trump. They are the anti-Trump Republicans. So the attempt was to appeal to the Nikki Haley Republicans, to the moderate Republicans. And remember, she has several Republican leaders who have endorsed her, including people like Liz Cheney, Dick Cheney, even the vice president of former President Trump, Mike Pence, several others, in fact, have been backing her in this election because they love the Republican Party, but they don't like Trump. They don't like the MAGA movement. So therefore, they are siding with her. So advice was given to Kamala to move rightward. What are some of the mistakes I would consider? Some people would say new attempt to shift rightward. What did we see? What did she do? She started giving interviews. And where did she give interviews? She gave several interviews, but two of the interviews are significant. One was to Fox TV. Brett Baier interviewed her. And that most people, quite a lot of analysts consider she bombed in that interview. I actually don't agree. I think what happened I watched the Brett Baier interview. It was supposed to be a long interview, but they cut it short because the way it became a combative debate between Brett Baier and Kamala Harris. I think the fault was in Brett Baier himself. He's such a biased TV anchor, number one. In fact, if you know, in the past, his major disaster was when he had interviewed President Trump in the past. Another disaster. This time, Kamala Harris. And what was the major blunders that he committed? He gave her a poll. And that poll, basically, he said, well, look at the poll. and he showed that on the screen and said, what, 70% people are saying that the country is going in the wrong direction. More than 70, I think maybe 79% people are saying. And only 21% are saying that it is going in the right direction. Now, Kamala didn't get the chance while she was being interviewed. She didn't look carefully at that poll. The poll was a poll of 652 voters, which is totally incredible in elections. You need a poll of at least minimum 1,300 voters. So this was basically, and that was also, it was a university poll of a particular campus law school. That was, at least the source was mentioned. Kamala should have looked at it and told him that this is not a credible poll, but she took the question and she started answering, and then he started hammering her, telling her that, well, you are supposed to go to the next page, a new leaf. Where will you go from here? Because your popularity is very low. And maybe in that she kind of escaped the question and answered it in a way which was considered combative. Anyway, the interview ended. But I think the very fact that Kamala went on the Fox TV, and by the way, what is Fox TV? Nothing else but a Republican, hardcore Republican TV, owned by Rupert Murdoch, of course. And she got a chance to speak to the Republican voters, but she couldn't make her point very well because she kept hammering Trump much more than explaining her own position. So that was one attempt to shift rightward. The other attempt she did, which was a great success, was the interview with Howard Stern. Now, Howard Stern is perhaps more popular in the US than the entire Fox TV, according to me, the kind of following Howard Stern has. And that was a superb interview. Now, so one hit, one miss. And the attempt is still going on. And the reason is one of her advisors is Anthony Scaramucci, who has joined recently, who at one time, if you remember, Scaramucci was President Trump's communications director. And later on, Trump had actually chucked him out of the job. So Scaramucci is now helping Kamala Harris in the so-called campaign. And his advice is that the entire campaign, which is seen by Republicans or by right-wingers as very left, socialist, should kind of move towards the center. And that is a good advice because, in a way, most American presidents who win, they pitch at the center, what we call in election language as the median voter theorem. But instead of going into that in details, let me point out that the shift rightwards is fine, but there is a risk here. And what is the risk? If you shift rightward too much, you start losing your left-wing voters. The voters that at one time rooted for her and increased her surging popularity. Now, many of them have become very critical. They say that she's moving rightward. Of course, it's a campaign strategy. Many of them forget that when she comes to power as the next president, perhaps she's not going to carry on a Republican agenda, but there is criticism on that front. In fact, the criticism becomes more credible because what is happening, a very large section of, I would argue, the Arab voters, the Middle East voters, the Palestinian voters, many of who stay in the battleground states, they do not like the shift of Kamala Harris, rightward. Number two, they don't like the fact that Kamala Harris is supporting Israel. In fact, in that Fox TV interview, one of the questions was, which country do you consider as your biggest enemy? The bread buyer asked Kamala, and Kamala, without batting an eyelid, straight said Iran. In fact, bread buyer tried to dodge her by saying, I had thought China. But again, she said, no, Iran. Now, of course, in a way, it shows a certain clarity of mind because right now, Iran versus US, there is a sharp conflict given the conflict in the Middle East, given the entire war being unleashed by the Israeli president against Palestinians, and how that war has moved into Hezbollah territory in Iran. So I think her answer was very clear, but it signals to the Middle Eastern voters that maybe when Kamala will come to power, she might be very anti-Iran, and that sort of chunk of voters, many of them who live in Michigan, they live in Pennsylvania, they live in some of the other battleground states, they start shifting. But where will they shift? Will they go to Trump? If they do, that will be a disaster for Kamala. But suppose they don't go to Trump, there is a third alternative. They might end up going to the environmental party candidate who is kind of very pro Palestine. She's anti-Israel. So now that candidate is not going to win, Judy Stein. She's not going to win, but then she ends up cutting Kamala's vote. And that is again a threat, not in the entire country, but in the battleground states. So there is a risk in this shift rightward, as I pointed out. But some people think it's a great opportunity if a large section of moderate Republicans were to shift towards Kamala, then Kamala would beat Trump hands down, given the fact that she has consolidated the Democratic Party behind her. She has all the votes of the large sections of progressives. Now, there is another problem that we have noticed in the dip that has happened in let's say the last 10 days or so, and that is worrisome, that Kamala is polling very high among black voters. Black women, massive surge. Black men, a little less or a lot less. Latinos, again, she's much, her Latino popularity among Latino voters is much higher than that of Trump. But is it as high as Biden got during the last election? No. Biden had much higher popularity among Latino voters, among black voters, including black males. Now, that is something that Kamala needs to really worry about, because if you look at the last poll, Biden beat Trump because he ended up getting a majority not only among black and Latino voters, but including white voters, where Kamala is not doing so well, especially among white male voters, especially white male voters who have not gone to college or haven't had higher education. That is basically the working class white voters, which constitutes in some ways the base of MAGA, which is supporting Trump. Now, that's where she needs to make some changes. So now, what has she done right? This is where I think she has taken a risk. Partly, if she succeeds in getting the Republican voters on her side, the moderate Republicans, the Nikki Haley Republicans, she's going to beat Trump through and through. But what about the slide among the black male voters, the slide among, let's say, the Latino voters? Not slide, but not as high as what President Biden had got in the last election. That's where she needs to work. And that work she has basically outsourced to President Obama. Now, that I think is going great. I just watched three campaign stops by President Obama, and the three places where he has campaigned recently are Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Then he came down to Tucson, Arizona, and the last one that he did was in Las Vegas, Nevada. Now remember, all these three are battleground states. And Obama simply roasted Trump. I mean, Obama is such an effective speaker. He's such a brilliant speaker. And the way he connected with the audience, he simply roasted Trump. And that, I think, is going to work great. Now, some people feel that I'll go into what Obama said and how he has roasted Trump. But some people feel that Obama, after all, most voters by now have formed their opinion. Majority, some people say 95% voters have already formed their opinion. Some people say, let's say about 85%, because we have in America what we call the independents. Other than Democrats and Republicans, we have independents. So how many of the independents have finally made up their mind, we still don't know. And many of these independents are at the center. They can move rightwards to the Republicans, leftwards to the Democrats. Now, what is it that Obama said, and what else other than the shift that we are talking about? What else? How else can Obama help Kamala Harris? And that is the most interesting question now that the polls are almost around the corner. He can help the base voters of the Democratic Party, blacks and whites and the progressives and women and others, to come out and vote in big numbers. That is a big, serious problem in American politics of late. There was a time, 1940s, because I studied polling in the US at University of California, Los Angeles. I remember I was taught that in the 1940s, 1950s, the American presidential polls, the turnout used to be a massive, very, very high. But it started declining around, I would say, 1990s, when the big television came, when the entire polling became the campaigns became a sort of entertainment for the public. There is a shift, sort of the turnouts went down. Now, if you can bring about a massive turnout, like President Biden did, then he beat Trump hollow. That is what Kamala needs to do. And that's where Obama becomes very instrumental in this entire campaign. Obama can help because the fact that Obama speaks so brilliantly, he appeals to a very large audience. Each time you see Obama walking in to give a speech, and the crowds just go applauding and, they kind of go crazy. And these are very large audiences, all on television and, live debates, and people can see it on YouTube and other places. So that helps Kamala a great deal. In fact, in the next couple of weeks, there are plans to bring Michelle Obama, not only former President Barack Obama, and then other leaders with Kamala, and they're going to do joint rallies. But let me first say, what did Obama say that appealed to me, has appealed to millions of Americans? Obama contrasts Trump with Kamala Harris, and he takes very simple issues. He begins by saying things like, Obama points out that inflation is kind of high, and Kamala is trying to bring in policies which will help mothers or parents who have their children in terms of, let's say, when they purchase diapers or when they purchase a car seat and things of that sort. The prices have gone up, and his argument is that Kamala is going to bring about a certain change whereby these things will be priced lower. In fact, he points out that, look, inflation is high, but it is coming down slowly, trickling down. It's sliding slowly. And then Obama points out that, just picture, when did President Trump ever change a diaper? Can he change a diaper? And the crowds keep, laughing, and they are so thrilled to hear that. Obama said, "Look, I myself, when I went to buy a diaper, I realized that the price of diaper is so expensive, and I have changed it for my daughters." But can you think of Trump doing it? Obviously not. What is Trump? According to Obama, he says he's just an old 78-year-old trillionaire who only thinks of himself, never about the country. He adds the same thing about, for example, can Trump change a tire in the car? He talks about Tim Walz, who is the vice presidential candidate under Kamala Harris of the Democratic Party. He says Tim Walz can take one of these old time cars which are considered classic, and he has the ability to change and open the entire car and put it back together. But forget about that. Can Trump even change a tire? Has he ever changed a tire? No, he cannot. So his point is that Trump is just a rich, spoiled businessman who's got a massive ego. He just wants basically power for himself and his cronies, who are all rich billionaires, trillionaires, whom when Trump will come, he will just give them, if Trump wins, will just give them huge tax breaks. Whereas when if Kamala comes to power, and Kamala is going to change and transform America. She is going to help the middle class. She is going to help those families who are basically being hurt because of, let's say, the long period, the last few years that have lasted because of the pandemic. Following the pandemic, what happened to the economy, the inflation rate going up, unemployment being hit. So his point is that Kamala is going to do that when she becomes the president, because Kamala is the type of person who fights for people, who doesn't think of herself. But Trump is just the opposite. Now, I think this campaign, the way it is moving now, if Kamala, President Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, Tim Walz, other Democratic Party leaders, in fact, I have even noticed Bill Clinton, although Bill Clinton pointed out that, hey, I'm like 2 months younger than Trump, and he was also very critical of Trump. But but people who are more dynamic right now in the campaign trail, if they work with Kamala and if they can do what Obama does, a magic when he speaks, if they continue that unrelentlessly, attack Trump, where Trump is making one mistake after another, and can keep giving the alternative, and they can finally come and sort of tell America that if Kamala were to become president, how is she going to transform America? Then I think it is going to be victory. Kamala Harris will be the next US president. But if she falters from that, if she falls for the trap of things like Fox News, with people like Brett Baier sort of firing at her, then that, I think, is not going to help the polls very much. So all the best. We'll make many more such podcasts on this campaign as it unrolls. The next one we will make on President Trump. Thank you from Power Pixar.